quadratic relationship, and it was significant, but it only increased the R square of the model by 0.2%. It wasn't really worth it. It made it more difficult to interpret, so I just left it off. The year that the home was built, the quality of the home, the number of stories of the home, decking, foundation type, whether or not it had a garage, and the square foot of the garage, and the fireplace. Those are all variables that I checked and were not significant. Bedrooms and bathrooms are typically something that is very significant to the value of a home, and that's usually the first thing you say when you're out buying a house. First thing you say is how many bedrooms do I want, how many bathrooms do I want. That data was not available consistently or reliably, so I was unable to test for that, and I do think it would have contributed significantly to the overall. So this is not my data. This is what I wish my data looked like. So when we're doing regressions, when we want to see trends and things like that, this is what we like to see. There's a very obvious trend going on here. We have a nice bundling of data points. So that's a good model. This is what my data looks like. Not quite as linear, not quite as obvious. So again, that speaks to the accuracy of the model and how well we can predict what the value of these homes are going to be. So the consequence of that is you're going to see some ranges. I'm not able to give you an exact value, I'll give you some ranges of values of where these are going to be. So looking at single family homes, the average sale price for a home in the last 10-year time frame is what I looked at is $115,211. It ranged somewhere between 101 and 128. With 33 homes lost, that equates to an average of about $3.8 million, somewhere in between $3.3 and $4.2 million. The regression, these are some values that how that affects home price. So acreage, if you increased the acreage of a home by 1 acre, it would increase the value of that home by an average of $8,923, plus or minus about $5,907. So that's a pretty big plus or minus, and again, that's where this unpredictability comes in. Condition, every time you increase the condition of the home, it goes up by $32,000 on average. If you increase the number of plumbing fixtures by 1, it goes up almost $20,000. For every square foot that you increase the home, it increases, for every 1% that you increase the square footage, it increases by $267. To manufacture the home, it decreases the value by an average of $22,000. And so there are 7 erosion zones that go up in increments of 10. So there are, sorry, 2015 is already like 2020, 2030, 2040, 50, and 60. So every 10 years that you go up, if you're in a later erosion zone, it will increase the value of your home by $7,000 for every zone further away from the ocean that you are. I identified 18 vacation cabin residences at about 3.5 acres. The only significant variable was its erosion zone. How close was it to the erosion zone? So at 18 residences, it's about $738,000 on average, somewhere between $500,000 and $973,000. And for vacation cabin residences, for every zone that you move away, it will increase the value of your home by an average of just over $4,000. Other residential, so that includes things typically like a garage or a shop or a shed or something that you put on a lot next to your home. There were 9 of these buildings that have been eroded away. Average sale price of just over $53,000, so an average of $480,000 approximately is the estimated loss, somewhere between $250,000 and $700,000. Undeveloped land is the majority of what has been lost up to this point. So there have been 323 undeveloped lots totaling 487 acres. The size of the lot and the erosion zone were significant. If you're outside of an erosion zone, the average parcel value was $47,000. If you're inside the erosion zone, it's $7,200 per acre. So at 487 acres lost with an average price per acre of $7,207, there's an average loss of $3.5 million, but somewhere between $2.2 and $4.8 million. For every zone away from that you move in the erosion zone, you'll gain in value about $6,200. For every acre, you increase about $960. 37 exempt properties. These are just properties that are either government owned or owned by a nonprofit or NGO, so they don't have to pay taxes, but they're typically bare land. A couple properties for the county, but for the most part, they're bare land. We've lost about 400 acres there. So again, with an average price break of $7,200, about 2.8, almost $2.9 million, somewhere between 1.8 and almost $4 million for the 10 properties. For the unknown lots, I just assumed that the characteristics of the lots that were unknown, they didn't have any data for, matched similar characteristics to what had already been eroded. So I just assigned the same proportion to the unknown lots. If I assumed that they were all bare land, it would change the value by about $2 million. But basically, of the 117 unknown lots, we know that we lost 1,059 acres. So unknown are undeveloped, exempt properties. There's some assumptions. You can ask them about it later since we're short on time. So kind of a summary of what we're looking at is we've lost a total of 2,018 acres, 537 parcels, and we're right at about $14 million to $26.7 million of value has been lost up to this point, with an estimate of just over $20 million. Projected erosion is an additional 499 acres, 499 parcels on total of 547 acres are projected to erode by 2060. Most of those, or a lot of those, are going to be single-family homes and undeveloped land. That's where the majority of those are. So what that means is that if we look at projected impacts, we're projected to lose about $25 million to almost $35 million. Right around $30 million is we're projected to lose by 2060. Those are in today's dollars. This shows when those losses are going to happen for the most part. So we're still seeing mostly bare land being lost, and just where things are projected. We have until about 2040 to where we see the biggest loss. So there's still time if we do something to prevent quite a bit of loss from happening. Property taxes, really quickly, are just another thing that I looked at. The way the property taxes work is they say they take the whole pie and they divide it by the value of the properties. So if you're losing property value, that just means that each person is responsible for a bigger piece of the pie, so it redistributes the tax burden. So for every home they have to downgrade a value, either because it's eroded away or because it's in an erosion zone, and so they just basically give it a value of 0. That means that everybody else that lives in that same taxing district as you is now responsible for your tax burden, and that just gets bigger and bigger every single time. So up to this point, they had to redistribute about $300,000 in tax obligation from people that were in the erosion zone onto other people. Okay. So I went through that kind of quickly because I know we're kind of short on time. One thing I would like to point out is I have a new website out called wildcoasteconomist.com. It literally went live on Tuesday of last week, and I'm hoping that it's going to be a resource for people out here for all things economics out here on the coast. And so with that in mind, you'll see one of the things I have up here are economic studies. So I'm trying to collect as many economic studies that are geographically relevant to this area and have to do with the marine environment in particular. So if you have any of those studies, I know a lot of them are hidden away at various agencies and things like that, please send them my way if you're willing to make them available to people, and I'd like to use this as a resource for people to have access to them. So with that, I will open it up to questions.
I have one question, and it amplifies a remark that you made a long time ago. I think we were talking about the value of ecosystem services with Northern Economics. It was your comment that it's almost not worth doing these studies because the value of ecosystem services is so high that you can't really compensate for the loss of those ecosystem services. And I think we're seeing with the erosion that's happening in the North Coast up there a real example of that kind of issue, that we need to preserve the ecosystem services that we have, and we need to understand them.
I agree. And this only looked at property values for bare land, homes, and things like that. This study doesn't look into ecosystem services. It doesn't look at the potential risk to the highway, some other things like that that I'm still trying to evaluate. So we're still at $20 million on average. That has eroded, $30 million projected. That's $50 million total through 2060. It's very significant, and this type of study and this information can be really used to justify the cost. Anytime you go out and you ask for money to do a project and do something like this, they're going to say, well, why would we spend this money? Why would we do that? And And so you need to justify the benefit that you're getting to justify the cost, and so this helps to do that, to make that argument.
Hey, Kevin, so, I think I missed it, but I didn't see that if the water hose breaks down a little more and starts kind of going up for the drainage ditches, it seems like it's gonna take out all the cranberry water, like just by, increase salinity and start to run. Was that in that number?
It is not, no, that's the third part of the study.
Oh,
That's
okay.
forthcoming, that I plan to look at, but just haven't finished it yet, so it's not in these numbers, but that is the next step.
And I would really, I'd say, something I suggested before, it was great to see a drone fly kind of up there, because I think once that water, I think getting a visual of what's gonna happen if that water starts moving up through the bogs, where it's gonna end up at. But essentially, we're gonna have kind of an island out there. And I can't imagine what the infrastructure costs are gonna be to try to service that and reroute the road around. It's really, that seems like that would be something to start thinking about. What those projected infrastructure costs are gonna be to service that area with water and, everything.
So Kevin,
Yes,
does
sir.
part three include some of those services like power and water and sewer, et cetera, or not?
I am not looking at those. So I'm working with the Department of Ecology to look at sunk costs right now, which are basically, we are in talks with some utility companies to find out how much money they're spending to defend or replace some of these things that are already being eroded away, but we're not projecting forward, other than the section of the freeway, the highway right there.
Well, that goes to both the infrastructure questions as well as economics for those organizations that provide those services. The whole economic, the whole rebuilding everything that needs to be rebuilt to go around that issue. So we're basically looking at property values, and that's pretty much it at this stage with this, right?
Correct.
And just kind of a general comment, I mean, we have infrastructure needs, the whole country does. But with 16 years of largely unfunded war, there's not money to take care of these kind of problems and the kind of solutions some of the people come up with. And one of the gentlemen up here said that, a lot of this is out of his control. Well, it's in our control. We need to let our legislators know at the national level. We're tired of war. We want to make, we want our tax monies to come and fix our infrastructure, fix our schools, take care of our people instead of bombing the hell out of people in the Mideast. That's my
So the next person up is Kyle, who's going to talk to us about goose management, which is something that actually sounds to be pretty interesting. So let's have at it.
The center button. So that's your forward and backwards.
All right. Well, thank you for hanging in there. Yeah, I'm going to throw a little bit of a different topic at y'all and see how it goes over. My name is Kyle Spraggins. I'm the new waterfowl section manager for WDFW. I'm located in Olympia, but my background has been quite varied, but always revolved around waterfowl. So this was a topic that actually has some deep history for me, but also just steeped in history. But where I was trying to orient it is how it actually revolves particularly around this region. While I am new to Washington, Willapa Bay and some of the topics that revolve around goose management have been sort of part of my training, part of my experiences for quite some time now. So we'll see how this unravels. From a historical perspective, waterfowl management gets lumped into this one big topic. To be clear, waterfowl covers ducks, geese, and swans. a lot of the driving force in the history of waterfowl management comes from the duck side of things. A lot of these actions revolved around the creation of conservation organizations back in the 30s, the establishment of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in 1918, the establishment of the federal duck stamp in 34, and then the Pittman-Robertson funds, which are the taxation on guns and ammo and other some other items that then feed into a federal fund that gets redistributed to states for use towards management activities. What transpired from that was this sort of urgency towards protection and acquisition of lands, building up to the 1986 North American Waterfowl Management Plan, which again was largely oriented towards the duck concept of problems. This cartoon was drawn by Ding Darling, who was the first, he was a cartoonist, but he was also the first chief of what later has become the Fish and Wildlife Service and part of the USGS biological branch. From an ecological perspective, these migratory bird flyways is what sets the scene for all bird management. It sort of takes on a different characteristic depending on the type of bird you're talking about, and certainly for game birds, it actually also takes on this administrative role. In North America, we fall in 4 different flyways: Pacific, Central, Mississippi, and Atlantic. And these are generally guided by the fact that migratory birds, long-distance migrants, are moving in these pathways that are fairly repeatable every year and tend to be zoned in very particular parts of the country. But this is where geese really throw a wrench into this whole model of waterfowl management, because geese are very different. Their breeding grounds are usually not nearly as distributed as some of the duck populations, and there aren't that many different species or populations to begin with. So worldwide, there's only 27 populations of geese. Here in the Pacific Flyway, we would deal with 17 of those. So 17 of the 27 we deal with in this Pacific Flyway. This is sort of a host of the different species that we get to think about. Snow geese, brant, white fronts, Dusky Canada geese, and this is an Aleutian goose. There's a whole other group of them, but they all come with the story. And in fact, while the waterfowl management sort of history was driven by that duck collapse and sort of this grassroots organization background, the story starts actually long ago for goose management. We just didn't really realize it until about the 1960s. So yes, once upon a time, in an island far, far away, the Russian fur trade actually took foxes from mainland Alaska, dumped red foxes and Arctic foxes out on the very far western part of the Aleutian chain, so they didn't have to travel 3,000 miles to the mainland to get fur. And what happened was this ecological crash on the islands. What's important to note is that in these western Aleutian chain islands, bald eagles were not present. They weren't a predator for a lot of the big bird populations, both seabirds, and for us, the Aleutian cackling goose now, Canada goose then, they were outside of that realm. They did not have that pressure of bald eagle predation. And so this was just a massive production zone in the Western Islands. With the introduction of those foxes, massive collapses occurred, and really we only started documenting them once anybody was starting to pay attention to the island, the biotic parts of these islands. So then 55 years ago, this guy down here in the bottom right, Bob Sea Otter Jones, who was recognized as the first refuge manager of what's now Alaska Maritime, the Aleutian Island Chain Refuge, gets the Coast Guard to drop him off on a rowboat because he basically said, well, I think these Aleutian geese are still out there somewhere. And I think they're out on this one little island that's sort of off by itself, really rugged. Ships can't get there. So the Coast Guard drops him off, he rows to shore, and sure enough, he finds what's about the last 700 geese in 1962. 700 to 800. Aleutian geese on this one little island out in the Aleutian chain. So that's one big event that sort of strings together this coincidental sequence in some respects of how goose management, particularly in the Pacific Flyway, sort of unraveled. So in '62, that remnant population was found on Boulder Island of Aleutian cackling geese. In 1964, the 9.2 earthquake hit the Prince William Sound, which altered the dusky Canada goose population, which I'll talk about here in a second. In '67, the Aleutians were actually listed pre the ESA because of how restricted of a population they were. In 1975, the California Central Valley had a complete closure on all Canada-like subspecies. So that included Aleutians, cacklers, everything that was down there, was complete closure. In 1984, up on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, a massive plan, a very important plan, the Hazen Bay Goose Management Plan, was this predecessor to an agreement between the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the subsistence users up in that part of Alaska to control and shut down harvest on a lot of different species, particularly the four main geese that breed up on that refuge. In 1986, the North American Waterfowl Management Plan initiated, but prior to that, because of a lot of this goose activity, there were a lot of emphasis on some of the national wildlife refuges for acquisition or some sort of objective that tied to a goose population. If you look back on a lot of those documents, they tie pretty strongly to particular species of geese. And then the final one that I put on there is that in '91, there was a complete ban on lead shot on the Yukon Delta. That expanded later on down into the Central Flyway, and then of course now there's a complete non-tox requirement on waterfowl hunting. But that started back then because of very obvious impacts to both eiders and geese up on the Yukon Delta. So I'm going to touch a couple of those other stories real quick. So that 9.2 earthquake was dead punched right in Prince William Sound, and the dusky Canada goose population, the majority of them, nest right here in the Copper River Delta. What happened was this red zone uplifted and the blue zone subsided. And in the Copper River Delta, that actually turned into a 7-foot uplifting. And you can see the line right there. And so what happened was it actually knocked this acceleration of succession, plant succession, in a very quick span of time. It knocked it back to the point where actually dusky Canada geese benefited for a short period of time, and it crashed hard because suddenly the forest was encroaching in what used to be sedge meadow. There were all these activities that were put into place, such as putting artificial nesting islands out there. These still exist. There's about 400 of those in the Copper River Delta that help supplement. They're not the sole nesting source, but they do help supplement nesting productivity up in that region for the dusky Canada goose. Down here in the wintering areas, dusky Canada geese, the historic range was the Willamette Valley all the way up through the lower Columbia River and Willapa Bay. So there was a lot of effort towards making sure that certain habitats were in place down on this side of the flyway, particularly when that event occurred. And this is where I'm talking about. So the earthquake sort of knocked back a little bit. They had this run of acceleration, and then quickly there was this fall off in the 80s. Well, this was right around the time where all those trees started really getting some growth out on the Copper River Delta. The other goose that I mentioned was the cackling Canada goose. So on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, this refuge, the Yukon Delta National Wildlife Refuge, trades back and forth with the Arctic National Refuge for how big they are. This refuge is about 20 million acres. There's 51 villages that are located within the bounds of this refuge. And this little area in here holds about 1 million breeding geese and 10 million shorebird. The numbers start getting crazy when you really start looking into them. But all 4 of the geese that were in that coast, cackling Canada geese, Pacific white fronts, black brant, which you all are very familiar with in this bay, and then emperor geese, all are in that same zone. What's interesting is that both cackling geese and white fronts took a real nosedive. I didn't show much before the mid-80s sort of crash, but both were at really lows when that management plan was signed. Cackling geese got as low as 25,000. What's interesting is that there wasn't really the noticeable decline in these two, emperor geese and Pacific black brant. What's important to note is that these two, cackling geese and white fronts, are very dependent on terrestrial habitats during the wintertime. Nowadays, that's taken the tone of agricultural lands, but they've always been tied to the terrestrial side of the equation. Emperor geese and black brant are the last two populations of geese that are solely dependent on their native food resources. Black brant are an eelgrass obligate, and emperor geese winter on the Aleutian Islands, and they focus on blue mussels. None of the other 25 goose populations can you say that for. They all have some sort of supplemental tie to either crops that are grown, grain, something. There's something else that they're taking advantage of on the landscape. So, when this crash happened in the 80s and the goose management plan got put in place, that complete closure of harvest up on this area, the breeding grounds, had a huge impact. Suddenly, there was not this, there wasn't this sort of dueling problem on both the breeding grounds and the wintering grounds. There was the ability for the breeding grounds to provide enough production. So what the sort of the bigger picture of what came out of all these storylines is that there are these time periods where the noticeable declines occurred. In all of these stories that I mentioned, they initiated very directed surveys, both aerial and ground nest monitoring, banding, big band monitoring programs, and then the research intensified to really understand what was it that was driving the decline, and then what could be done to increase both production and the value that these geese were getting both on the breeding and the wintering grounds. But I also mentioned research. So coincidentally, around this time in the 90s was right when satellite telemetry was really starting to become more accessible to some of the researchers, particularly to the size that you could put on geese. In 96, well, they marked them in the early 90s. In the early 90s, Craig Ely, who's up in Alaska, and John Takakawa, who's USGS down in the San Francisco Bay, started marking white fronts to actually look at, well, wait, where are these birds going, and when are they getting there, and what direction, where are they passing through? And these types of activities really started to try to link what's happening on the breeding grounds and where is that playing out in the wintering areas. And so once they really started honing in on some of the impact areas, the really important zones on the wintering grounds, they initially did that through band recoveries and neck collar resites. And so that's where a lot of sort of where on the landscape should certain reptiles be. But then more of that came into play for understanding the when. When is it important to be implementing some of these protections on the ground? From that 1986 North American Management Plan, the Waterfowl Management Plan, that is what established these joint ventures, habitat joint ventures. We sit in what's now called the Pacific Birds Habitat Joint Venture. It used to be Pacific Coast Joint Venture. But there's 23 of these habitat joint ventures scattered across North America, specifically trying to aim habitat activities towards, at the time, very much towards the benefit of different waterfowl species. But in reality, it's capturing the important functions of the different wetland types that are unique to each one of these bioregions that help different waterfowl species during the winter months. And here in Washington, it gets very interesting because we really are this nexus point for the breeding grounds, the wintering grounds, and birds passing through. So while we serve important roles in both the breeding and the wintering, we have these other species such as sea ducks and a lot of the geese that are passing through, and particularly 2 species of swans that are also very reliant in this region. So my position is focused on trying to coordinate activities related to all those that are listed there. But in terms of the geese,